Welcome to Avenue M. My name is Joey Taylor.
And I'm Haroon Mogul.
We're two men on a journey of faith and meaning. In each episode, we unpack the moments that shape us, the struggles that build us, and the questions that intrigue us. For this episode, we talked to Reed Frerichs. Reed is the founder of The Lesson, he's the creator of Inner Story, and he's an executive coach at MIT Sloan. Reed explores the inner stories that shape leadership, performance, and who we become under pressure. This conversation asks the question, what if the stories that shape us aren't the ones we tell, but the ones we're still living? We talk about the hidden threads that connect our lives, from his experience as an actor to entrepreneurship, from sports to spirituality, and from failure to transformation. Along the way, we explore what it means to become the author of your own story, while discovering that the most meaningful journeys are never just about yourself.
Joey asked me how we met. And so I told him we sat next to each other at a dinner. I remember thinking to myself, I really want to talk to this guy one-on-one because he seems absolutely fascinating. You know, sometimes you meet someone and you know there's a lot more there. And there's definitely a backstory in a good way. And there's probably so many cool things you're working on. So that's where we met. We had a couple conversations after that. But I would love to know, what are you working on these days?
Yeah. So you remember these key turning points in your life, right? But I remember it, what started at UT Austin, and I was in the final semester in business. And I was just like, I really don't want to go into business right now. I don't really know what I want to do other than I'd taken an elective in acting. And I was sort of an introverted kid. I may have taken some public speaking and some different courses, but I really was drawn to sort of the creative work and really just expression through characters. And so I'd taken some classes. I came up with a plan. I mean, everybody was going to all their interviews. All the big companies were coming into the business school, and everybody was excited. I had my resume, but I just was kind of almost nervous because I knew I didn't want to do that. So I came up with a plan. I had pitched it to my parents, which they were like, what the heck? What? The acting and the creatives is not in our family anywhere. So came up with a 1-year plan, and I was like, I'm going to get a job and I'm going to do this. And I got lucky a couple months into that. I had been auditioning for a year previously, so I sort of built a little bit of my network. But there was a lot going on in Austin, Texas at the time. Richard Linklater, with Robert Rodriguez, a lot of film was happening there, a lot of independent film. And so I basically got an opportunity and for a film called Powder, which was Jeff Goldblum. They shot it in Houston. So I drove to Houston, and I'm convinced I only got the role because my hair was really long at the time coming out of college. And they probably were like, we need somebody else in this movie that looks a little different. But yeah, that was my first break. And what was neat about that film was, unlike most supporting roles or sort of local hire roles, I was hired for the whole shoot. So it was about 6-7 weeks rather than just a day or two. And that gave me a chance to really go to set even on the days I wasn't, filming, and just learn. And Jeff Goldblum in particular, I didn't realize at this time, but he was an acting coach in LA. And so he was always coaching. So when he showed up, and he was booked for, I think, for a few weeks, had a really cool role, but he was just such a professional, and he could recognize right away that myself and some other guys were probably pretty green and needed a little bit of guidance. And so I have some very, good stories around what he shared and helped on that process. But that's really was the start of that process. And I booked some other roles in Texas, and then got to a point where it was time to move to LA about a year later. And so that's what moved me to LA.
So can I ask you to link those two things together? You said you were something of an introvert, then you go into acting. I feel like there's something there that we need to understand. How do you go from being an introvert to acting? And maybe does that speak to what Jeff Goldblum said, or is it something different?
I'll connect the dots here. But yes, it was at the time I didn't quite understand what that sort of driving mission or personal mission for me was, or sort of purpose. I realize it now and sort of the work I do. And I grew up in a great family. I mean, really, really great family in Texas. But there was not a lot of talk about like real issues and real things going on. And so I just had a lot of questions around like expressing myself and really having real conversations. And I felt like, this was a chance to dive into some deeper work as a person too, and through characters at the time. But now in the work I'm doing with leaders and executives, I find it's still trying to extract that deeper why or that deeper, emotional core into their business or into their, pitching customers and investors. And so that sort of was the connective dot. Jeff Goldblum in particular was really great at just kind of giving us like the blueprint on how to be a professional. I always share this story. It was a day that I was not filming, but I went to the set and I was watching him and they were filming. He was like a science teacher in the film. And they had this studio set up where they had the classroom or whatever. And we were just watching him. And as they said they were getting ready to shoot, they started bringing in all the extras or the actors that would be in the background actors that would be in the scene. And I watched as he stood outside the door as he was the teacher. Now, this isn't being filmed. This is before the filming in the classroom, but he just was in character. And as the students were being brought in, he starts greeting them and he's asking them questions. He's calling them by their name. And I was like, how does he know all this stuff? I mean, he had obviously created the characters, but he also had reached out to the extras casting director and got a bio on each of the people in his classroom and really got to understand who they were. So he knew them. And so when they went to shoot, he was like the classic one take wonder. Every scene, he would just nail the first, how it was scripted. And then the director would be like, great, now you can, next couple takes, you can just do however you want to. And he would improv and kind of bring some flavor into the scene. And it was just amazing to watch because he's calling them out by name in the classroom and asking them how their weekend was. And, hey, you were playing volleyball, how's that going? Like he treated it was just such a great lesson in how a professional actor works and in the deeper work you need to do as an actor. And so that was one instance that really sort of informed through many others and acting coaches in LA, some really good ones. Tommy Lee Jones, I had an audition with. It was really pivotal in sort of the work I'm doing now, but it's just diving into the deeper work you need to do.
It's funny that you say Powder because Powder is one of those movies that sort of like sticks in my imagination. I don't know why. I think there's that one scene where the main character is thrown into the puddle. And I think
Yes.
maybe I watched it when I was at a certain like developmental age or whatever, but it felt to me just so incredibly tragic. And I like for whatever reason, that one image has really kind of cemented in my mind.
Oh my God, that was such a tough scene to film. I was in that scene. Yes, that was a tough one. It was freezing cold in Houston. And I can't remember, obviously we were filming like around January, I think that during that year. So that puddle, and they were, had the rain machines to make it, feel like it was raining outside. And we were in this gym and we bust out of the door and we're taking to the puddle and we're harassing them. And we were told that the water truck that was providing the rain and all the water in the scene was going to be heated. Well, the heater didn't work. So all I remember is like talk about like method acting or like just diving right into the scene. It was freezing cold, and I can't remember what it was outside, but it was, let's say it was in the 30s, and this rain was coming down freezing cold. And I just remember like some of the guys like freaking out and like between takes were like huddled up with coach and shaking uncontrollably. So in a lot of ways, I'm sure the director was loving that because it just made it so much more real. But yeah, I just remember it was really cold.
It's amazing how powerful stories are and how things like that can just stick with you forever. My day job is I run a storytelling organization here in Cincinnati.
Oh, wow.
I often say that stories are the primary way that we make sense of the universe, that
Yes.
it's the way I know who I am, and I know who you are, and I know who we are as a collective. You talk about yourself as a narrative intelligence coach. Give us a little bit of like some handles for what that means for you. How are you incorporating story into your work?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And I think, that's sort of how I felt too, Joey. I mean, just stories are so powerful in a way, especially now with technology accelerating so quickly and how we can, create meaning and understanding. And so it's sort of been like a lifelong, everyday process of learning for myself too, and asking questions with different people I work with. Narrative intelligence, sort of, I've looked it up. It's obviously the term's been around for years. I mean, there's articles back to a group at MIT that had a group with some people from Harvard, and they were trying to like understand each other, and it was sort of a way to communicate during that time in the early 90s, I believe. But it's really an open term, and I just thought it was an interesting term given what's going on to go from not just storytelling, but more about story thinking in more real time. And so a lot of the work I was doing when I was leading when I was at Intel's accelerator a few years ago, I just remember when I first started there, I was really nervous and I had a little bit of imposter syndrome. Like, what am I doing here? I don't have much of a tech background. And so we got to work with some of the best founders in the country, and they'd had venture backing, and they were usually around the seed stage to Series A. And I just remember like sitting in the room, and then they started telling their stories, and I was like, wow, like, yeah, there's a lot of work that can be done here because they're super tech, a lot of data, and they were sort of all over the place. And so a lot of that work started in storytelling, but as we did the deeper work and really getting to know the founder, I started learn. It's evolving. Every day they're iterating and changing, and I just thought, you're very rarely stuck in one story for a while, and it's constantly evolving, and that's really what sort of informed the work because. Once you start embracing every day and every challenge and every pivot and every failure and everything that you're trying to overcome, especially in that world, or same thing with athletes and other professions, it really sort of informs that it's really a real time story thinking. And we live inside stories. The more you think about it, like we're always inside our heads in the story. Something's driving us that day. Sometimes it's tied to beliefs that we've, been anchored to for a long time. But really, the more you can kind of get into the growth mindset and start to really think of story as a way to get closer to decisions and action, I think it can be quite powerful.
You said you grew up in Texas, and you said you had a great family. Acting and the creative arts were maybe not in the cards as they were
Yeah.
initially read. What story did you get from growing up in Texas?
Gosh, that's a good one. Well, I grew up, my dad, he was actually an entrepreneur really himself. He wouldn't call himself that, but he started his own business and construction and came from a ranching family. Like we had ranches in Arizona before we moved to Texas and then in Texas. And so being around sort of that real practical hard work. And, here's what, I learned a lot of lessons obviously from him and the sort of that background. But what I love about Texas when I go back is it's almost like a different world, and there's, you can take that a lot of different ways, but they're just very real. Like the fact that you go to the grocery store and people are saying, "Hey, how you doing?" And they welcome you, or you pull out of the parking lot and people are like, "Oh yeah, come on in." You can you can go in where most of these other cities like LA, Boston, they're like honking at you, like trying to race forward. It's just a different sort of mentality there, I think, and they really are about family, and there's sort of an identity around just keeping it real. So I really got a lot out of that.
You a Spurs fan?
I am a Spurs fan, major. Yeah, that was
What
brutal.
story are you telling yourself now?
Oh God. Well, I changed again. It's evolving and changing because now I've really been interested. I've been posting on this I have a newsletter called Inner Story that I started, and I'm doing some posting there really around leadership. But I'm a fanatic around sports. I mean, when I was 6 years old, I was reading the sports page cover to cover. I was memorizing statistics. I was very math oriented, and I'm just fascinated by what's happening in sports, especially like you look back and where it's growing and evolving, and so many people are involved in the experience now. You mentioned the World Cup, but look at the Knicks and the Spurs series, and what a fascinating series. So with the Spurs, this Wembenyama thing is caught everybody's attention, but really caught mine on the leadership side because this is a guy that's constantly, he's very driven. But if you look back, even at that game he played against Chet Holmgren back in the under 19 tournament, you can see he has he's trying to regulate his emotion and really grow as a leader, but it's been difficult. At times for him. I mean, you can just watch the video and you can see how disappointed and upset he was at scoring 22 points. I think Chet had 10 in that game, and that was 4 or 5 years ago. So looking at him now, I just see a guy who's really trying to carve out a different path as a leader. Everybody knows the stories about, studying with the monks over the summer. He's hired, Akeem Olajuwon, Jamal Crawford, and other people, former pros, to work on different aspects of his game. The playoffs was, he had the concussion, then he had the elbow in the Minnesota series where he got ejected. And then, Oklahoma City series obviously it was a heck of a series, but I think when he came into the Knicks series, I got the sense that I was feeling as a fan that we were a little bit too overconfident and thinking that after beating OKC, that we had sort of won the championship and we're just going to cruise right in because everybody had built up the West as being so superior. But given what the Knicks were doing and that run they were on, and the Knicks had played the Spurs better in the regular season, they had beaten us 2 out of 3. It was a hard pill to swallow. It was a great series. I mean, every game was close. As you saw, we were up, I think, double digits in almost every game. But it was very clear we are a young team, and Victor and the rest of those young players, Dylan Harper and Stefan Castle, and they have a lot to learn still. And there's a lot of growth that can happen. But yeah, I sorry for going on, but I love that series and loved what happened this year of basketball.
Yeah, we're both big basketball fans. I'm the classic NBA fan that doesn't watch until the playoffs. I'm like I'm following along on
Well,
my
I
phone,
think a lot
whatever.
of people are that way, Joey.
Yeah, no. Yeah, but I've kind of fell in love with Stefan Castle. That guy
Yeah,
is, man, he's so tough and like so physical, and I just, yeah, I love his game so much. It felt to me a little bit like the story with the Spurs culminated with
yes,
the OKC series, and like
yeah,
actually like that extra chapter with the Knicks, they weren't quite ready for, because they weren't prepared to actually get through OKC. That was such a surprise.
yeah,
Even the Chet Holmgren stuff. I mean, he was this big rival that was gonna kind of
yeah.
like offset Wemby, and he disappeared.
He disappeared.
Wemby totally vanquished the dragon, and he was gone forever. Like I don't.
Yeah,
When is he going to show up? And maybe not even on OKC next year, right? And so
yeah.
it felt like the story, like they didn't make space for the story to actually continue all the way to the mountaintop. Like they had
I
already
agree.
kind of concluded.
I think New York even showed their team. They showed the ending of the OKC series where the Spurs were celebrating, they're crying, it all felt like they'd won the championship. But I think, very different than how the Knicks, when they defeated Cleveland, very different end of the series. So I think they showed that, if I remember reading on it, they showed that to New York, and New York was kind of like, okay, yeah, these guys think they just won the championship. So yeah, no, I think that culmination at the mountaintop, I think that's a very good analogy.
Yeah, it reminds me of Lord of the Rings. Or I'm gonna go with this. Don't stop me,
Yes,
Joey. When you watch Return of the King and the ring is destroyed, you're like, awesome, it's over. But then the movie goes on for another 40 minutes, and you just
yes.
don't know what to do with all that extra energy. There's just a lot of adrenaline that has nowhere to go. But I wanted to ask, because I do love basketball. I know Joe loves basketball, but I wanted to ask, on your end, you talked about Powder, then you talked about Intel. Again, we've got a
Hmm.
gap there. So yeah, probably a longer gap, but what did you do after Powder? Did it hit you and
Yeah.
say, this is what I want to do, and then you followed that
It
story?
did, and you mentioned Lord of the Rings, so I gotta connect a couple dots here. So what really informs storytelling and really narrative for me is the hero's journey. It's sort of the mythology from Joseph Campbell, Christopher Vogler's taken, other great story coaches and script writing coaches have taken it, for our authors like Blake Snyder have taken it forward. I really like that structure. And really, when you look at it, it really ties into a lot of psychology and neuroscience and the stuff that a lot of coaches I work with now. And so that's also really informed it. Yes, there's a big gap there. And it was really a gap for me that I really didn't understand at the time. It was a lot of pain from going from Powder, showing up. I remember the first day I showed up in LA, and I'm thinking, I'm going to take this, like probably like every actor coming into town, I'm going to take this town by storm. I remember showing up at my first meeting with my manager at the time that had signed me after Powder. He was sort of he'd been around a long time in Hollywood, and Paul Rudd was one of his clients and was sitting there in his office. I walked in, I remember it very well. I walked in, and he's sitting there reading. Paul Rudd was getting ready for an audition, and he'd already come off of Clueless, and I was like, oh, okay, that's Paul Rudd. And he said, my manager's like, yeah, Paul's going to take you to lunch, and he's going to kind of give you the rundown of LA and what you need to do as an actor. And so of course, I was a little naive and excited. And then I go in for a meeting with him after that, with my manager, and he's like, you're not going to audition for a year. And I was like, what? Like, I just, I've got some acting credits. I'm ready to go hit it. And he's like, you don't know anything. And I was like, great. Okay. And he's like, I'm going to get you with this acting coach, Howard Fine, really great acting coach. And you got to go learn. You got to really learn acting. And I was like, okay. So that was sort of the connective dot to really how to take it serious. The Tommy Lee Jones, right before the Tommy Lee Jones audition, I was in a callback for. It was a film he was directing called Three Burials of Melquiades Estrada. And I remember in that audition, just before that, I'd talked to my agent. I was getting kind of frustrated because my auditions had started to tail down. I had come off a series called Push, which was an ABC series that didn't last but about 6 or 7 episodes. I remember after that reality TV hit, I just remember like all these auditions were starting to really slow down. They were making a lot of reality TV for cheap, and it just became much more difficult. And so I remember my agent had reached out to some casting directors. He's like, look, the feedback on your acting is good. He's like, He goes, I just wonder if you have enough life experience, like really hard life. A lot of these actors have been through a lot, and they use that in the work. And I at the time I really didn't understand it, just other than the surface level. And then I remember this Tommy Lee Jones interview or audition for that. And I came into the audition, I was nervous because in the scene, I was supposed to talk almost down to him. Like I was his superior. I was like this wealthy kid who flew in on a private jet and he was like the ranch hand and I was supposed to talk. So that was kind of tough in itself. But I just remember he was behind the camera and he just started coaching me for, it seemed like about 30 to 45 minutes and really asking questions that were deeper my personal background and how to weave that and integrate that into the character. And then when we did the scene, again, it was completely different. And so those have been some of the things that have informed the work. But right after that, we moved from LA to Florida to fill in the gap you were asking about. We had quite a few tragedies that happened in our family. My sister's daughter had really rare cancer called ATRT, only 12 cases at the time in the US. So we spent a lot of time with her. She passed away at 18 months. And then we moved. My wife's father was diagnosed with lung cancer, stage 4. And so we moved to Florida and just sort of adapted. And at the time, I'd been doing a little bit of producing development with the Blair Witch creator and director, Ed Sanchez, who became a friend of mine. I started doing a lot of story development, had some projects that we were trying to get produced. And then I moved to Florida in 2008, right during the financial crisis. I started working for a money management firm. A family member of mine had a firm and they were obviously dealing with a lot during that time. So I kind of got thrown into the fire in finance and business, learned a lot quickly. And then from there, started getting into entrepreneurship and investing. So there's been a lot of, and all through all of that, I just was kept going like, what am I doing? I'm taking on all these different things. I'm going from like creative work to story development to finance to then starting to invest in some ed tech companies and trying to learn that space. Anyways, it was just a long way of going like, where is this all going? And through all that, there was a lot of sort of shame and sort of like wondering like, I don't have any direction really here other than that particular job I was in. It wasn't until when I got to Intel and started to work and everybody started going, you have a really interesting background. And I was like, really? I was like, so all over the place. Like, and then as I started to really reflect on it and talk with others, I started to realize that that's part of the interesting connection that people have because every one of those experiences sort of informs your work and where you're going. And so I've tried to accept that more, that gap you mentioned is starting to make sense.
You do talk about how the story continues to evolve, right? Keeps evolving. I think the thing about story that's so compelling to me as a storyteller is the opportunity to be the narrator of your own life story.
Yes.
And I often say that thread finding is meaning making, right? Trying to find connected pieces between your story. Both Haroon and I are people of faith. This is kind of with that overlay, I think we would talk about the movement of God in our lives or the way God is showing up in our lives, the plan that God has for our life. But I think there are moments, to make it like a little lighthearted, like with Wemby losing the finals, that feel like the bottom drops out and you're like, whoa, this wasn't the story I was trying to write.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, do you have any thoughts about how to find coherence in your story, especially in moments that you don't plan for, and moments when the bottom drops out of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I kind of go back to like, so when I look at even like the Wemby or in sports stories or even any story you kind of see day to day, I look at those sort of beats, those story beats. And when you think of like, just like people were saying all year about Wemby, a lot of the experts was, typically most of these champions have got to suffer and feel pain, and that's kind of what happened to the Knicks last year. And most of the champions, Jordan, LeBron, you can go down the list, they had to really suffer pain. And in the hero's journey, there's all these sort of beats where you think you've been at the top. There's sort of that midpoint false hope, and then the bad guys closing in section where you kind of have that dark night of the soul, the all is lost moment. You think, oh God, this is never going to work, and that's when you sort of find that special thing that's going to take you over the top, and you sort of march back for that that climax moment. I think that informs so much of our life because that happens, and so I think the thing I've seen with coaching and founders and really getting to interview people like you guys do or really understand kind of where people are going is is just sort of shifting the mindset, because I think so much of how we are built is based on survival. And so we immediately go to protection, fear, fear based. Okay, I got to play it safe. And oftentimes we kind of over index or over extend ourselves to that safety. And I think with so much of it, shifting the mindset to understanding that that could actually be fuel for us to grow are those failures or those learnings and insights to kind of rapidly iterate around that. So whether you're a founder or an athlete or anybody who's looking for a career transition, looking at each of those experiences as fuel and just a piece of my journey that's going to launch me forward or help me find that next path forward. So that to me is what's really, especially in the last few years, I've noticed, because when I talk to founders, and it always starts as sort of executive coaching type work. Like even at MIT right now, I'm working in the business school part time, and really a lot of the founders I meet there are coming out of the Sloan Fellows program. It's a hard 12-month program. A lot of these people have already been out in the business world, and now they want to start a company. And when you start to ask them questions, their life, a lot of them are international. They have really fascinating lives, and they're really not seeing themselves in that light. They're not seeing how much gold they have in their story from the way how they grew up and how they were even thinking back at the age of 10 and hardships they've had to overcome and the resilience they've shown time and time again. So when you go back to the story, I typically like to use this mechanism called own, author, and act, which is taking you through to more quickly make those decisions, but also like owning your story right as it is. But in the author's part of it, you really want to look at how you can reframe, because they have beliefs about their story that sometimes are not serving them well, right? They're thinking back, well, that was a failure. And rather than maybe reframing it as, wow, I really have come a long way. And I actually have some skills here that I can showcase and tell in my story that will lead my business forward, maybe inspire teams to want to work for me, build networks. That's the other big thing I find with founders is you can't spend enough time on that alone, which is just building your network. And because there's so many people that want to help you on your journey, but you gotta be out there. You gotta tell them.
Our sponsor is the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue at Xavier University here in Cincinnati, which is dedicated to deepening understanding across faiths and promoting systemic change. You can learn more about the Brueggemann Center and Xavier University in the show notes. Now, back to the conversation.
So I wanted to go back to that moment where you took the acting class and there's a reason for that, because you touched on something really profound. And I think it's something a lot of people struggle with, certainly when they're younger, but maybe throughout a lot of their lives. So I do a lot of work with young Muslim students, high schoolers, college students, and there's only so much I can convey in a traditional classroom setting. Sometimes it's taking someone out of their comfort zone, literally in the sense of we do leadership retreats for students, we take them to Spain. And that's enough to kind of shake you out of a certain level of complacency to begin to have some conversations. With those who are younger, with high school students, sometimes it's literature, sometimes it's movies. Actually, right when we were doing our tech check before the episode started, Joey and I don't know how Catcher in the Rye came up, but we talked about Catcher in the Rye. Actually, with some of my students a few weeks back, we watched Good Will Hunting, which is kind of, the story of the emergence of the hero. What I'm wondering is, how do you get someone to begin to open up, to begin to see themselves as part of a story, to go from that moment when you realize life isn't just something that happens to you, but life is something that you get to participate in and maybe even have to participate in?
Yes, good question. Going back to acting, I remember very clearly in this coach out here in LA that was, I remember going up on stage and, there are people in our classroom that were on TV series and stuff. I was like, it's pretty good class. But I remember going up on stage and doing this scene and thinking, oh, because I felt like I always did drama pretty well, or that was sort of something I was motivated to do. And I remember like, oh, I think I did pretty good. And he asked the class, and of course the class is probably playing it safe. A lot of them are like, oh yeah, it was really good, mostly good feedback. And then he commented and said, that was awful. And I was like, oh God, what happened? And he's like, and he just ripped into me on like what I was sort of playing it safe with and what I wasn't doing that deeper work and understanding. And so he started again asking questions, kind of like Tommy Lee Jones, asked questions around the character, the deeper work. to where then when he said, now do the scene, it was sort of the same thing like in the Tommy Lee Jones audition. It was just, you don't even think about the lines because you're grounded in such an emotional and just foundational state that the lines just come out naturally because you come into the scene differently. You're trying to reach your objective and overcome the challenge within the scene differently. So with founders or anyone, even people I coach that are their students or in career transition, I find that sometimes it's easier for some than others, but I think that it's really about the types of questions you ask them and really establishing that trust that you're here to help guide them and, understanding again what they really value, what they care about. Because sometimes they're stuck in just going to school. I'm a student in these identities. And again, back to the hero's journey. What's cool about that in any story is the character starts in identity, fully in identity. And then as they go through the journey, at the end, they get closer to their essence. And it may not, in that story arc and that transformation, oftentimes isn't what they think it's going to be. And so with students, I think a lot of times they want to belong, they want to be, they're stuck in an identity, but we can have multiple identities, right? And identities can change. So it's trying to get a little bit closer to their essence and their sort of core values and what they really care about, what some of their, talents are. Oftentimes I find too, a lot of people are in a weird way protecting their talents and their strengths. So they're not even like putting those out there. If you start asking them questions about like what they enjoyed when they were 10 or 12 or, growing up, you start to find a lot of those connective threads. So, but I think the trust is really a big part of it. So like, it's kind of when you learn this in coaching too, but I really like to use this with any conversation is trying to acknowledge them for being there, to showing up and talking to you. And then asking some questions, trying to get close to, so they have the personal agency or autonomy to drive their story forward. And it's not about you guiding. And then at the end, again, acknowledging them for sharing that and trusting in you. So those are some things that I find that have helped. But every student or every client or every person you interview is different.
It's especially interesting to me now that I know that you're a Spurs fan, but I thought it was interesting that two of the last three pieces that you've released have been about a Knicks coach and then the Knicks player. I'm fascinated to hear how you know when you come across a story that it's worthy of kind of content production. So this is the most recent one. I thought it was great. Like the Jalen Brunson stuff, the magic is in the work, and obviously very is applicable to the work that you're doing. But is there like a spark? Is there something within you? Do you have a visceral response when you come across a piece of content?
That's
how
a
do you
good
know?
question. Well, I don't know. I think it's a little bit of testing as we go. Like, for example, I've already filmed a couple ones or written some pieces on Wembenyama, but I haven't released them because as I was doing them, things have already
changed.
Because
he's a loser. That's why.
Yeah,
right?
Now he lost. Right. And now I'm like, okay, that didn't make as much sense now. So now I'm like, okay, so I've decided what I'm going to try is an ongoing series on Wembenyama because I think because he's so fascinating in the work he's trying to do. I mean, even I was glad to see after the finals, he basically said in the post game news conference, like, I'm still learning, and this is the hardest lesson I've been through this series. Like the fact that he's very open with his sort of growth and learning, and it's also up and down. It's not like just all like, oh, he's great and everything. He's a perfect leader at the age of 22. I mean, think about it. I didn't know anything at 22. I don't know many people that really know a lot then. But the fact that he's willing to learn, again, going back to that growth mindset, I think he's a fascinating leader, especially given his international in the face of the NBA. People are calling him. I mean, it's going to be interesting to watch. I guess to answer your question, part of it I'm just learning on the fly. I think what I liked about Brunson, Mike Brown, I knew for a while, obviously, and he was a coach under Popovich in San Antonio, went on to Cleveland and Golden State with Kerr, and then Sacramento, and then he got fired. He worked for De'Aaron Fox. There's a connection there. I noticed a lot of people didn't highlight this, but I noticed that De'Aaron Fox waited for him in the tunnel after the locker room to congratulate him. I thought that was kind of cool, given that there was a little bit of tension there from their days in Sacramento. But what's informing me right now is just trying to stay relevant to the time, but also trying to find, again, that deeper story that's there. Because it's usually, I find like with a lot of sports, and I watch all the podcasts in sports, and I love a lot of different guys, but it's a lot of focus on the X's and O's. But I think there's still kind of a gap there with some of these deeper stories or inner story that, we can find within them, especially like Jalen Brunson. I mean, look at that second round pick. I mean, everybody knew of him when he won at Villanova in the championship. And obviously his dad's been a coach in the NBA, but what a fascinating story. People are coming out saying there's no way you can build a team around a guy who's 6'1", and he's, 6'1" at best probably. But yeah, I just find these stories kind of fascinating. I always in sports, I always had to work twice as hard, I feel like, because I was smaller. I would love sports. Some sports outgrew me, like basketball. But I found that I loved kind of that story within sports. Again, I think it's just because there's so much challenge and so many things you have to overcome.
Yeah, I'm finding this conversation especially confusing because I'm a Lakers fan. So I respect the Spurs, in the way one respects one's enemy and nemesis, right? Like they've done very well. So it's hard not to respect the Spurs. But for me, it's interesting, and this has never happened before. So like Joey, I grew up like a diehard basketball fan. I would watch. I mean, we grew up in New England, so Pacific Coast
Wait a
time,
second. You grew up
all
in
that.
New England? You were a Lakers fan?
Yes, yes. I learned
Oh, wow.
resilience, grit, and how to recover from blunt force trauma at a very young
Yes.
age. So it was actually because of my dad. And so I'll say this, a bit of a pivot. One of the reasons I found Wemby really interesting is my father came to the US in the 70s and found himself really moved by Kareem. And,
Yeah.
they had a lot in common, except Kareem was wealthy, famous, and athletic. But other than that, they're I guess they're Muslim, so there's that common
Yeah.
ground. And he was a Kareem fan, so he followed Kareem from the Bucks to the Lakers. And we were raised Lakers fans. And I think there was a little bit of that stubborn contrarian in us, that we were in Celtics country in the 80s and we were going to be Lakers fans. And Kareem, as I'm sure you know better than I do, was not the typical superstar, right? He
Right.
never really quite fit the role. He was always uncomfortable in the role. And there's something about Wemby that seems to echo that he's
Yeah.
unusual. He's cerebral in a different kind of way. He's willing to look at and reference points and perspectives that probably most people in sports,
Yeah.
let alone at the age of 22, would. And so certainly I think I was compelled by that. But like Joey, I loved sports. I grew up watching basketball. Nowadays, I don't really watch games till the playoffs. That's more just because I find I don't have the time. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
it's hard to take the time away. But I found myself gravitating to the Knicks, not because I'm a Knicks fan. I don't know that I'd ever say that, in the sense that, I mean, I haven't earned that title, right? But I spent a long time in New York, and there was something so electrifying about seeing a city
Yeah.
come together.
Yes.
And obviously it's New York, and we get to see what New Yorkers do on a different level because it's New York. People don't pay attention
Yeah.
to Cincinnati or Detroit or Chicago the way they do to New York. But that to me seemed exceptional. And actually, and I wanted to pivot to this. We have a lot of conversations about how we as Americans don't have a mainstream culture, a monoculture. I
Yeah.
don't know that I really believe that.
Yeah.
I do think that there are obviously a lot of silos and algorithms and fragmented experiences, but I think we actually still have quite a lot in common. We just
I
maybe
agree.
don't admit that.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I think that was a perfect example. I mean, I can't tell my Spurs fans this, or family, but I had a part of me rooting for the Knicks deep down. I have a family, friends that are New York, diehard New Yorkers, and one of them's in his 20s or whatever, and he's a sports fan. And I was really happy, really excited for him. I called him right after the series, and I was really genuinely happy because, you can see like how New York just sort of brought people together. And even if you're not a Knicks fan or even a basketball fan, you couldn't help but like want to be part of that experience. Like it was just amazing. Even in San Antonio, I was down there for game, I think 2. I didn't go to the game, but I went down. I wanted to get part of the experience. And you can't even imagine how many New Yorkers were in town. Like, I mean, people were in their jerseys, and it was actually fun to see and have really conversed with them because, to your point, it's really was like a culture. Like there was something more than basketball that was going on there, and seeing like not just the celebrities showing up at all those games. I think it was funny with the Taylor Swift thing, right? Because here she is with her friends wearing the New York stuff, but then I think in the Cleveland series, she was rooting for Cleveland. But it just goes to show you, people were so excited to be part of something bigger than themselves. And I think back to what you're saying with Kareem, I think Wemby is interesting because he's only going to help drive that forward, I think, with culture. And I think there's a part of us that all feel like we're an outsider, or we're a little bit either, a little different, right? And I think what's great about athletes like Kareem, or even in Wemby's case, is they sort of bring that out, that it's okay to be different and to carve your own path. Kind of two different things, but I do agree. Yes, I think you can't help but just be. I mean, look, the ratings showed it. I mean, San Antonio is a small market team. Obviously, Wemby's a big figure, but New York just crushed it. I mean, that was just such a great overall experience. And I hope there'll be more of that, you know? And by the way, both of you guys mentioned this, but the playoffs are a completely different experience in the league than the regular season.
Of course they are. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
of course they
it's
are.
like football. You better put on like some gear. Like you may want to train in boxing or UFC in the off season because it is a different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why they need to shorten the season so we can get straight to the
Yes.
playoffs.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So it's interesting to me because I love Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. It's been a framework that I've tried to apply to my life for a long time. And I also think that it can be overly individualistic,
Yes. Yeah.
meaning that like is everybody the hero? Everybody?
Yeah.
Really? And what you're getting at here with the New York story, which I think is, not just the Knicks, it's also Mamdani. It's a bunch of things that are kind of like sort of coalescing together to have this moment of revitalization for the city. But I also heard it in the little kind of vignette you shared about De'Aaron Fox, because that guy had a rough series in the finals. He had a rough series. In fact, he maybe single-handedly lost the series for them, depending on how you argue it. And so the idea that he could come outside of himself and go congratulate Mike Brown after they won the championship, for me, says that he's participating in a larger story than just his own. And so do you have any thoughts about what does it mean, not just to kind of craft your own story where you are the protagonist, where you're the hero, but also to step into stories of meaning and significance that are larger and bigger than you? You have any thoughts about that?
That's great. I do. I think, first of all, and I think you're right. I think the hero's journey is a little too focused on. So, what I've done with the hero's journey, for at least with coaching with founders, is try to extract it, or for narrative intelligence for that matter, is really extract down some of the key beats there. The call when something is, basically, I call it the call, the threshold, and the lesson, or the return with the lesson. And so if you can really extract it down to like the call, meaning something changes, you lost your job. My niece was diagnosed with cancer, or it could be an opportunity. Hey, I got an opportunity, but something's shifting within you. You're trying to make a decision. Usually there's a little bit of a debate section. Oh, I don't know if I should do this. But you then step into sort of that new world, and that threshold you have to go meet. And there's a lot of ups and downs, and you have to consistently learn and try to overcome those challenges. And then to return with the lesson is really just, what did I learn from this experience, and how do I integrate that going forward more actively in my life? And so from that framework, you can start to use it more than just like, hey, my life's on this big hero's journey. And it can be more day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year of how I'm looking at going through challenges. As far as what you mentioned about, stepping outside of yourself, they mention it sometimes in the hero's journey, but not enough, which is there's always a key mentor or somebody that's usually coming into that act two. It could be that's usually there's a little bit of conflict at first, but it's somebody who's there to kind of step in and help guide them. Do you remember in like Rudy or any of these stories, there's always a mentor, but I remember that famous scene, when Rudy's ready to quit and the mentor steps forward and kind of tells his story, in the locker room. Like there's just so many great opportunities where people are part of your journey. And that's kind of what I learned, too, in the last several years is even just being a small part of somebody's journey can be very valuable and very important. And I think it's a real opportunity. And plus, there's a lot of people that have already, maybe had some success in their life or been through a lot of those battles that want to give back. And actually, that gives them meaning to be part of your journey and share some things to help other people go on theirs. So, I often tell people, like, who are some of those people in your life? But also, like, start allowing yourself to be aware and letting people into your life, because they could be very valuable to you. And instead of trying to say, hey, I'm going to do it all myself, or very closed minded, and that, I know what I'm doing. I think it's very important to allow people to come in. And that's one of the things when we had the growth accelerator, really one of the things we scored on was trying to make sure they were coachable, because you could always tell the people that had thought they were smarter than everybody, didn't want anybody's help. And you're like, well, what are we going to be able to offer? So when we would start the program, we would have them share their story, their company story. It was usually pretty generic, like, hey, we're great. We're this new startup. They pitch it like they were probably told to pitch on watching a YouTube video or any of these templates. But what would change very quickly is we would say, hey, you're going to get a lot of perspective from mentors, from coaches, from experts, from people around you, from other founders in this program. We just asked you to keep an open mind. And sure enough, I can't tell you how many times they all would share later at the end when they get up and share their story completely different, because it was more about that journey and about all the people in their life and all the people that made that work for them.
The cover of the book of The Heroes with a Thousand Faces is a circle.
Yeah.
The idea, I think, in the framework, you tell me, you're the expert here, is that we always bring the boon back to the community that we came from, right? And so
That's right.
the telos, the point of this hero's journey is not actually our own heroic kind of status or whatever.
No.
It's actually for the sake of the community that we go
Yes.
on this journey. And so that for me is what kind of
100%.
keeps me grounded when I start to take myself too seriously or think I'm too big for my britches or whatever. Actually, this whole story isn't about me ultimately. It can't be.
Yeah. Well, and as you know, I mean, that's why people are, I think, unfulfilled oftentimes when they think the journey is all about themselves, and they get to the top and then they're unfulfilled, because it's really the people around them and that community that gives it meaning, you know? And so I like what you just said, because I use it sometimes in our presentations, but the mountain, like we're basically climbing a mountain and you come back down and it's like, what did you learn through that hero's journey? But you know, what's the point if it's just all about yourself?
Joey, will you get mad if I do lightning round? Joey gets upset when I do lightning round because he says lightning doesn't move that slowly. I
Ooh,
tell him
that's
that
He's
good.
like, here's lightning round. Now here's these huge philosophical questions that require a treatise from you in order to answer. But yeah, go for it.
I tell Joey that I am the hero of my own story and I set the speed of light in my own story. So it's totally fine. No, I have actual lightning round questions, if that's
Okay.
cool.
Sure.
Best mentor in a movie.
Gosh, best mentor in a movie. I'll try to be quick with that. There's so many. I mean, my favorite movie is Lonesome Dove. So, you know, with I think back to Augustus McCrae and Woodrow Call, Tommy Lee Jones, Robert Duvall just passed away, but I love that role he played as a mentor to Diane Lane's character in that. I thought that was one of the best. Another one I'll just throw out is, again, good. You mentioned Good Will Hunting, but I love the Robin Williams character in that.
My second question is going to be top 3 favorite movies. You've answered one, but you can add another 3 if you want, since this is a new
Okay,
question.
so those really, I'd say those 2 are definitely in there. Good Will Hunting, Lonesome Dove, and oh my God, there's so many. I probably have a list of 20, but I guess I'd go with The Godfather. There's something about The Godfather that always comes back. There's so much there. And Brando is such an amazing actor, obviously.
Worst Star Wars movie.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm going to go old school and go back to like Empire Strikes Back. I think a lot of people liked that one, but there was something about that didn't sit well. I don't remember coming out of that as a kid going, "Oh, this was how I love that movie." I was very disappointed for some reason. So I guess I'll say that one.
I was going to say worst mentor in a movie was Obi-Wan Kenobi, because one of his mentees became kind of a genocidal, world-ending maniac. But
Well, there you go. Actually, that's a really good point. I thought of that too one time. Everybody was so big on Obi-Wan, but he wasn't the ultimate mentor.
yeah,
for
that was.
reason.
I
Exactly.
mean, I guess maybe we're not responsible for the genocides our students commit, but one would at least have to pause and say, "Hey, you know, like he wiped out an entire planet." At least
Maybe that's why he sacrificed himself to.
Yeah, he just
Because he
couldn't
realized
live
he
with the
couldn't do
shame.
anything more.
Couldn't leave the shame.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite actor?
Favorite actor? Oh gosh, I keep coming back. There's several, but I'll just keep coming back to this one, Daniel Day-Lewis, because I just don't know many people. I know there's several others, but I'd say he puts in so much work, and he doesn't need the role. So when he takes on a role, I mean, you can read about it, that there's plenty of times where he's basically didn't want the role, and they had to keep, flying out to meet him if he was a cobbler in Italy or whatever job he was taking on at the time, because he just was living his life. He had to put in a certain amount of work before he'd even step on set. And that just shows you the commitment to the work.
Favorite city?
Favorite city.
You live in a few of them, it seems, or
God,
at least
I
spend
know.
a lot of time. Joey's looking for Cincinnati to come. I don't know what hand gesture Joey's making right now.
LA.
For those who are
LA.
listening,
Yeah.
LA.
Joey is just confusing both the guest and his co-host.
Favorite city. Okay. I'm gonna say a few things here. Okay. Number one, I've had the opportunity to travel a lot in the last 5 years. So I fell in love with Rome. Rome was much better than I thought it was going to be. Not necessarily to live there, but as far as travel, Rome, best country I thought was Croatia, but Rome was probably the best city. And then I will go back to the US, which is where I'm really torn between Boston and Austin, Texas. I've gone back to Austin a lot more recently, and I spend a lot of time obviously in Boston, but I'd say those 2 As much as the weather's so great in LA here, and you get really, it's hard to leave sometimes. Yeah, Boston or Austin, Texas.
That's
I
my
know I gave
lightning
you a
round,
lot.
Joey.
I didn't really answer the
That's
question of
good.
one.
No, it did. It did.
Can I ask one more question? This is not a part of the lightning round. I just thought it would be cool to give our audience an opportunity to know about the Inner Story podcast. What do you call it? A cinematic podcast, which sounds awesome to me. Just tell us like a little
That's
bit about
the
how.
aspiration.
Okay, all right. Tell us a little bit about that and like how our audience can get plugged into that.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you. So I call it a cinematic podcast because I think as we grow it, I've done a few interviews. I just interviewed Charlie Green, who was a Shark Tank this last year, had a really fascinating story. Alexis Contos, who's founded this company called The Breadwinners for female executives. That was a big highlight at South by. We have a number of really interesting guests. They're mostly across, whether they're athletes or creatives, actors, and a lot of founders. So it'll be a podcast that just again deeper stories with interesting people. You guys know this work very well. Cinematic came into it because I really want to try to at some point have some flagship episodes that really go a little bit deeper, like out in the nature, whether it's hiking or surfing or different activities that some of these guests go on. As part of, again, we kind of go across the hero's journey and the call, the threshold, the lesson as part of the story arc of the podcast. And so I thought it would just be interesting to, we get deeper into some essence questions and also nature and sort of spiritual side of things for people. And so that's where the cinematic part, we want to try to incorporate some of that B-roll and some of that into the episodes. We're going to release it starting in August, bi-weekly to start. Yeah, so it's going to be innerstorypodcast.com. It's also tied to a newsletter, the newsletter you mentioned on Substack. So there'll be some short form episodes, like some of the stuff I'm doing around sports that are more, just short, very short. And then there'll be like a 45-minute type podcast for some of the flagship episodes.
I'm excited for it. Thanks so
Cool.
much for making time to talk to us today. I feel like we should
I'm
do another
excited.
episode about just sports because I got takes I want to get off my
Joey's
chest.
got
but-
opinions.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's do it. And maybe I need to connect you guys when we're starting to talk sports on Inner Story because, yeah, I'd love to dive deep into sports anytime.
It's funny you say this. I think Kobe was the most, I'm not just saying this on the Lakers side, I think he was the most impactful athlete in my life because actually I remember his last game, I woke up, I had an early meeting the next day, but I forced myself to stay awake for his last game, watched the whole thing on my laptop. And I remember feeling so impossibly sad. And it was, and I reflected on it. I actually got to write a piece for the Washington Post, a farewell to Kobe. And because I was trying to process, like, why do I feel so sad? And sort of, like you said, I think there's something to that sometimes when you have a feeling, you sit with it and you follow it and you pursue it until you unfold what it actually means. And I said, here's a guy who started in 1996. He retired in 2016. And so much happened in my life that I didn't expect. Like I failed in so many ways. There were so many disappointments, heartaches, heartbreaks, opportunities that led nowhere, decisions that in hindsight, I wish I hadn't made. Just the usual stuff I think most of us do as we grow up.
Yeah.
And yet he had always been there in the same uniform.
Yeah.
Yes.
On the one hand, it felt like so much had happened in my life. And then on the other hand, it was just Kobe was still Kobe playing basketball. And then I realized, oh, he's gone.
Yeah.
And I will never again have quite there's an attachment you have to athletes when you're younger. That it's just, I think it's usually not the same for most people as you get older. It's not the same. It's almost like sometimes the athlete is the hero that you latch onto that helps you tell your own story.
Yes,
so
that's right.
I just thought it was
It's
really
sort of a
interesting.
mirror, right? It almost is like a mirror for your own story and sort of is guiding you that's out there. And obviously Kobe's story, as we know, it's the classic hero's journey in some ways, but just so many ups and downs and things he overcame. And and obviously the ending was tragic, but it's still, when I think back, everybody can picture probably that moment when they heard about when the accident.
I remember it was the late 1990s. It was Kobe and Shaq and the Lakers. I think they were actually losing to the Spurs in the late 90s in the playoffs. And, there was all this expectation that, now there was Shaq and Kobe and, the Lakers are going to win, and they were not winning, at least the way fans expected. And I remember it was towards the end of the game. The game was clearly over. It was Staples Center and pin drop silence in the arena. And someone screamed out, "Where's your pride?"
Yeah.
And it was the only thing you could hear. It was so loud that you could hear it
Really?
on the broadcast. And I remember thinking years later, I wonder if that single question like lodged itself into their brains, that to the point you made, which I think was so on point, that sometimes when you lose and you fail,
Yeah.
That's the actual thing that kicks your butt into gear.
Absolutely. Well, I remember that. I remember Game 6 of when Duncan went off, and that was Game 6 in Staples Center. I think this might have been the first time the Spurs had actually beaten the Lakers in a series on their way to an NBA. It might have been 2003. I bet it was 2003. And I remember that very clearly. Kobe was kind of like Wemby. He was crying he was very emotional on the sideline. And again, that's why I kind of like when I see like these stories about Wemby and some of the ups and downs and when he good or bad when he cries. But I think it's great. Like he had this great line about refusing to not acknowledge his emotions. I think it's something very powerful. And I think Kobe, the classic competitor, the ultimate competitor who's trying to become their best version, I think, that's part of the deal. And whether they do it publicly or privately, I think that's the level of commitment and emotional depth that they are on that journey. And I think Kobe's a perfect example.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Zach Swellbar for recording our theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know what questions we should be asking and who else we should be talking to.